Chapter 16. It could have once been a spider, if spiders ever got to be the size of cattle. From the thick layer of white web that covered the room, floor to ceiling, it couldn't have been anything else. Jill stared down at the curled, bristling legs of the abomination, her skin crawling. The creature that had attacked her by the courtyard entrance had been terrifying, so alien that she hadn't been able to relate it to anything. Spiders, on the other hand, she already hated them, hated their dark, bristling bodies and skittering legs. This one had been the mother of all of them, and even dead it frightened her.
Hasn't been dead long, though.
She forced herself to look at it, at the thick puddles of greenish ichor that dripped from the holes in its rounded, hairy body. It had been shot several times, and from the noxious ooze that seeped from the wounds, she guessed that it had still been alive and crawling not 20 minutes ago, maybe less. She shuddered and stepped away towards the double metal doors that led out of the webbed chamber. Whispering streams of the sticky stuff clung to her boots, making it a struggle to move. She took careful, deliberate steps, determined not to fall. Thought of being covered in spider web, having it clinging to her entire body. She shuddered again, swallowing thickly.
Think about something else? Anything?
At least she knew she was on the right track, and close behind to whoever had triggered the tunnel mechanism. Neat trick, that. When she'd reached the area where the pit had been, she thought that maybe she'd gotten lost after all. The gaping hole had been gone, smooth stone in its place. Looking up, she'd seen the ragged edges of the pit suspended overhead. The entire center section of the tunnel had been flipped over, turned like a giant wheel by some miracle of engineering.
The doors had led to another straight, empty tunnel. A giant boulder stood at one end, and past that, the room she was about to leave.
Jill grabbed the handle of one of the doors and pushed it open, stumbling out into yet another gloomy passage. She leaned back against the door and breathed deeply, barely resisting the urge to brush wildly at her clothes.
I could blow away zombies and monsters with the best of them. Show me a spider and I lose my freaking mind.
The short, empty tunnel ran left to right in front of her, a door at either end. But the door to her left was set into the same wall as the one she'd just exited, leading back towards the courtyard. Jill opted for the one on the right, hoping that her sense of direction was still intact. The metal door creaked open and she stepped in, feeling the change in the air almost immediately. The tunnel split in front of her. To the right, a thickening of shadow where the rock walls opened into yet another corridor. To her left was a small elevator shaft like the ones in the courtyard. A warm, delicious wind swept down over her, sweet air like a forgotten dream. Jill grinned and started for the shaft. It seemed as if the lift's platform had been taken up. Chances were good that she was still on the trail of Enrico's killer.
But maybe not. Maybe he went the other way, and you're about to lose him.
Jill hesitated, gazing wistfully at the small shaft, and then turned around, sighing. She had to at least take a look. She walked into the stone corridor that stretched in front of her, the temperature immediately dropping back to the now familiar, unpleasant chill. The tunnel extended several feet to her right and dead-ended. To her left, a massive rounded boulder like the one she'd seen before marked the other end, a good 100 feet away. And there was something small laying in front of it. Something blue. Frowning, Jill walked towards the giant rock, trying to make out the blue object. Halfway down the dim tunnel was an offshoot to the left, and she recognized the metal plate next to it as the same kind of mechanism that had moved the pit. She stepped into the small offshoot, examining the worn stones at its opening. There was a small door to her right, and Jill realized that the passage and room could be hidden by the way of the mechanism. The walls turned to block the entrance.
Geez, it must have taken them years to set all this up. And to think I was impressed with the house.
She opened the door and looked inside. A mid-sized square room of rough stone. Statue of a bird on pedestal, the only decoration. There was no other exit, and Jill felt a sudden rush of relief as the implication sank in. She could leave the underground tunnels. Killer had left already. Smiling, she stepped back out into the corridor and started towards the giant rock, still curious about the blue thing. As she got closer, she saw that it was a book, bound in blue-dyed leather. It had been thrown carelessly against the base of the stone, laying face down and open. She slung the Remington across her back and crouched down to pick it up. It was a book box. Her father had told her about them, though she had never actually seen one. There was a cutaway section of pages behind the cover where valuables could be hidden, though this one was empty. She flipped it closed, tracing the gold-leaf letters of the title, Eagle of East, Wolf of West, as she started back towards the elevator. Didn't sound like much of a thriller, though it was nicely bound. Jill froze as the stone beneath her left foot sank down a tiny bit. She realized at the same instant that the entire tunnel gently sloped away from where she was standing.
Oh no.
Behind her, a deep, thundering sound of rock grating against rock. Dropping the book, Jill sprinted for cover, arms and legs pumping as the rumbling grew louder, the tripped boulder picking up momentum. The dark opening of the offshoot seemed miles away.
Oh, make it gonna die!
And she could almost feel the tons of stone bearing down on her. Wanted desperately to look, but knew that the split-second difference would kill her. In a final, desperate burst of speed, she dove for the opening, crashing to the floor and jerking her legs in as the massive rock rolled past, missing her by inches. Even as she drew in her next gasping breath, the boulder hit the end of the tunnel with an explosive, bone-jarring crunch that shook the underground passage. For a moment, it was all she could do to huddle against the cold floor and not throw up. When that passed, she slowly got to her feet and dusted herself off. The heels of her hands were abraded, both her knees bruised from the running dive. Compared to being smashed flat by a big rock, she thought she had definitely made the right choice. Jill unstrapped the Remington and headed for the elevator shaft, very much looking forward to leaving the underground behind, keeping her fingers crossed that whatever came next, it wouldn't be cold, and that there wouldn't be any spiders. The basement was flooded, all right. Chris stood at the top of a short ramp that led to the basement doors, staring down at his own unsmiling face reflected off the shimmering water. It looked cold and deep. After he'd left Rebecca, he'd continued down the hall and found room 003 at the end, the ladder to the basement level tucked discreetly behind a bookcase in a neatly kept bedroom. He descended into a chilled concrete corridor with buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, a dramatic change from the plain wood and simple style of the bunkhouse above.
At least I found the basement.
It appeared that killing Plant 42 was their only option for escape after all. He'd seen no other exit from the bunkhouse, which meant that it had to be past the plant's room, or else there was no back door, a thought that left him distinctly unsettled. It didn't seem possible, but then neither did a carnivorous plant.
And you won't find out until you get this over with.
Chris sighed and stepped into the water. It was cold and had an unpleasant chemical smell. He waded down to the door, water sliding up over his knees and finally stopping at mid-thigh, washing gently. Shivering, he pushed the door open and moved inside. The basement was dominated by a giant glass-fronted tank in the center of the room that extended floor to ceiling, a large, jagged hole towards the bottom right-hand side. Chris wasn't that good at judging volume, but to fill the whole area with water, he figured that the tank had to have held several thousands of gallons.
What the hell were they studying that needed that much? Tidal waves?
It didn't matter. He was cold, and he wanted to find what he needed to find and get back to dry land. He started off towards the left, slowly, straining against the push and pull of the gently lapping waves. It was totally unreal, wading through a well-lit concrete room, though he supposed it was no stranger than anything else he'd experienced since the Alpha Copter had set down. Everything about the Spencer estate had a dreamlike feel to it, as if it existed in its own reality far removed from the rest of the world.
Try nightmare-like. Killer plants, giant snakes, walking dead.
All that's missing is a flying saucer and maybe a dinosaur. He heard a soft sloshing behind him and glanced over his shoulder to see a thick, triangular fin rise up from the water 20 feet away and slide towards him. A wavering gray shadow beneath. Panic shot through him, an all-encompassing panic that seared away rational thought. He took a giant running step and realized that he couldn't run as he plunged face first into the cold chemical water and came up gasping, spluttering tainted liquid from his nose and mouth, hoping to God Rebecca was right about the virus having burned itself out. He whipped his head around, eyes burning, searching for the fin, and saw that it had halved the distance between them. He could see it now. The shark, its rippling, distorted body sliding easily through the water 10 or 12 feet long. its broad tail lashing forward. The black, soulless eyes set above its pointed grin.
When the bullets misfire,
Chris stumbled away backward, knowing that he didn't stand a chance of outrunning it. Wheeling his arms for balance, he sloshed heavily through the dragging water, turning himself sideways and managing a few more steps before the shark was on top of him, and he leaped to the side, dodging the animal and slapping the water as violently as he could, churning in the foaming waves. The shark slid past him, its smooth, heavy body brushing against his leg. As soon as it was past, Chris stumbled after it, splashing wildly to keep up as he turned the corner in the flooded room. If he could stay close enough, it wouldn't be able to turn to get at him, except that in seconds, the shark would have the room to maneuver. He could see 2 doors ahead on their left, but the giant fish was already leaving him behind, heading towards the next corner to turn around and come back for him. Chris took a deep breath and plunged into the water, knowing it was crazy but that he didn't have a better chance. He stroked desperately towards the first door, kicking off against the cement floor to propel himself forward in great bounding leaps. He hit the door just as the shark was turning up ahead and grabbed for the handle, choking, and it was locked. Shit. Chris jammed his hand into his wet vest and came up with Alias's keys, fumbling through them as the thing glided closer with a wide, pointed grin opening. He shoved the key into the lock, the last key on the ring that he hadn't found the room for, slammed his shoulder against the door at the same time, the shark now only a few feet away. The door flew open and Chris stumbled in, falling and kicking frantically. His boot connected solidly with the shark's fleshy snout, deflecting it from the opening. In a flash, he was on his feet. He threw his weight into the door, and in a slap of water, it was closed. He sat against the door, wiping at his stinging eyes with the back of his hand. The lapping water settled gently into smaller and smaller ripples as he caught his breath and his vision cleared. For now, he was safe. He unholstered his Beretta and ejected the dripping magazine, wondering how the hell he was going to make it back upstairs. Looking around the small room, he saw nothing he could use as a weapon. One wall was lined with buttons and switches, and he trudged over to look at them, drawn to a blinking red light in the far corner.
Looks like I found a control room. Aces. Maybe I could turn off the lights to get the shark to go to sleep.
There was a lever set next to the flashing light, and Chris stared down at the faded tape beneath it, feeling a numb disbelief as he read the printed letters. Emergency Drainage System.
You've got to be kidding me! Why didn't anyone pull this thing the second the tank broke?
The answer occurred to him even as he thought it. The people who worked here were scientists. No way were they going to turn down the opportunity to study their precious Plant 42, sucking up water from the man-made lake. Chris grabbed the lever and pushed it down. There was a sliding metallic noise outside, and immediately the water level started to drop. Within a minute, the last of it had flowed out from under the door, and a gurgling liquid gas came from the direction of the broken tank. He walked back to the door, opening it carefully, and heard the frantic, wet thumps of a very big fish trying to swim through air. Chris grinned, thinking that he should probably feel pity for the helpless creature, and hoping instead that it died a long, agonizing death. Bite me. Wesker had shot 4 of the shuffling, gasping umbrella workers on his way to the computer room on level 3. He hadn't recognized any of them, though he was pretty sure that the second one he'd taken out had been Steve Keller, one of the guys from Special Research. Steve always wore penny loafers, and the pallid, dried-up husk that had reached for him by the stairs had been wearing Steve's brand. It appeared that the effects of the viral spill had been harsher in the labs. Less messy, but no less disquieting. Creatures that roamed the halls outside seemed to have been totally dehydrated, their limbs withered and stringy, their eyes like shriveled grapes. Wesker had dodged several of them, but the ones he'd been forced to put down had scarcely bled at all. He sat at the computer in the cool, sterile room and waited for the system to boot up, feeling truly on top of things for the first time all day. He'd had earlier moments, of course, the way he'd handled Barry, finding the wolf metal in the tunnels. Even shooting Ellen Smith in the face had given him a momentary sense of accomplishment, a feeling that he was in control of what was happening. But so much had gone wrong along the way that he hadn't had time to enjoy any of his successes.
But now I'm here. The stars aren't already dead. They will be soon. Assuming I don't suffer some massive lapse of skill, I'll be out of here within half an hour. Mission complete.
There were still dangers, but Wesker could handle them. The mesh monkeys, the MA2s, were undoubtedly loose in the power room. They were easy enough to get past as long as you didn't stop running. He should know, he'd helped come up with the design. And then there was the big man, the tyrant, waiting one level down in his glass shell, sleeping the sweet, dreamless sleep of the damned.
From which he'll surely never wake. What a waste. So much power crossed off the failure by the boys as white.
A gentle musical tone informed him that the system was ready. Wesker pulled a notebook out of his vest and opened it to the list of codes. Though he already knew them, John Howe had set the system up months ago, using his name and the name of his girlfriend, Ada, as access keys. Wesker tapped out the first of the passwords that would allow him to unlock the laboratory doors, feeling a sudden, vague wistfulness for the excitement of the day. It would be over so soon, and there would be no one to witness his achievements, to share his fond memories after the fact. Now that he thought about it, it was a shame that none of the stars would be joining him. The only thing better than a grand finale was a grand finale with an audience. Chapter 17. Jill had taken the elevator into what seemed to be another part of the garden or courtyard, although the area had been isolated, surrounded by trees. She'd guessed as much from the few overgrown potted plants and the welcome sounds of the forest beyond the low railing. There had been nothing to see but a rusting door set into a nondescript, overgrown wall welded shut, and a large, open well, like a stone wading pool. Inside had been a short, spiral staircase leading down to another small elevator, which I took. But now where the hell am I? The room that the elevator had led to was unlike any other part of the estate she'd seen. It lacked the strange, fetid charm of the mansion or the dripping gloom of the underground. It was as though she'd walked out of a gothic horror story and into a military complex, a utilitarian's bleak paradise. She was standing in a large, steel-reinforced concrete room, the walls painted a muddy industrial orange. Metal ducts and overhead pipes lined the upper walls, and the room was rather aptly titled XDRB-1, painted across the concrete in black several feet high. Any sense she'd had of where she was in relation to the rest of the estate was totally gone. Although it's as cold as everywhere else, at least I know I'm still on the grounds. There was a heavy metal door on one side of the room, firmly locked. The sign to the left of it stated that it was only to be opened in case of a first-class emergency. She figured that the B1 on the wall stood for Basement Level 1, her theory confirmed by the bolted ladder that led down through a narrow shaft into concrete. Where there was a B1, B2 naturally followed. And considering the alternative, it looks like that's where I'm headed. The other option is to go back through the underground tunnels. She peered down the ladder shaft, only able to see a square of concrete at the bottom. Sighing, she held on to the Remington and started down. As soon as she hit the last rung, she turned anxiously and faced a much smaller room, as bland and industrial as the first. Inset fluorescent lights on the ceiling, a gray metal door, concrete walls and floor. She walked through quickly, starting to feel hopeful that there were no more creatures or traps. So far, the basement levels had offered nothing more dangerous than a lack of decorum. She opened the door and her hope faded as the dry, dusty smell of long-dead flesh hit her. She stepped out onto a cement walkway that led over a flight of descending stairs, a metal railing circling the path. At the top of the steps was a crumpled zombie, so emaciated and shriveled that it appeared mummified. She held the shotgun ready and walked slowly towards the stairs, noting that there was a small branching off to the left where the railing stopped. She darted a quick look around the corner and saw that it was clear. Still watching the desiccated corpse carefully, she edged down the short corridor and stopped at the door on her left. The sign next to the door read Visual Data Room, and the door itself was unlocked. It opened up into a still, gray room with a long meeting table in the center, a slide projector set up in front of a portable screen at the end. There was a phone on a small stand pushed against the right wall. Jill hurried over, knowing that it was too much to hope for, but having to check just the same. It wasn't a phone at all, but an intercom system that didn't seem to work. Sighing, she stepped past an ornamental pillar and walked around the table, glancing at the empty slide projector. She let her gaze wander, looking for anything of interest, and it stopped on a flat, featureless square of metal set into the wall, about the size of a sheet of paper. Jill stepped over to take a closer look. There was a flat bar at the top. She touched it lightly, and the panel slid down into the wall, revealing a large red button. She looked around the quiet room, trying to imagine what the trap would be, and then realized that there wouldn't be a trap at all. The mansion, the tunnels, all of it was rigged to keep people from getting here, to these basement levels. They're way too efficiently dull to be anything but where the real work gets done. She knew instinctively that her logic was sound. This was a boardroom, a place for drinking bad coffee and sitting through meetings with colleagues. Nothing was going to jump out at her if she pushed the button. Jill pushed it. And behind her, the ornamental pillar slid to one side with a smooth, mechanical hum. Behind the pillar were several shelves, stacked with files, and something that glittered in the soft gray light of the room. Jill hurried over and picked up a metal key, the top of it imprinted with a tiny lightning bolt. Slipping it into her pocket, she flipped through a few of the files. They were all stamped with the Umbrella logo, though most of them were too thick and ponderous to spend time sorting through. The title on one of the reports told her what she needed to know, what she'd already suspected. Umbrella, Bioweapons Report, Research and Development. Nodding slowly, Jill put the file back. She'd finally found the real research facilities, and she knew that the STARS trader would be somewhere in these rooms. She was going to have to be very careful. With a final glance around her, Jill decided to go see if she could find the lock that the key belonged to. It was time to place the last few pieces of the puzzle that Umbrella had set up and that the STARS had sacrificed themselves trying to solve. The twisted, gnarled root of Plant 42 took up a large corner of the basement room, the bulk of it hanging down in slender, fleshy tendrils that almost touched the floor. A few of the tiny, worm-like threads squirmed blindly around each other, twisting slowly back and forth as if looking for the water supply that Chris had drained.
God, that's disgusting!
Chris nodded agreement. Besides the control room he'd escaped into, there had only been 2 other chambers in the basement. One of them had been stacked with boxes of cartridges for all kinds of weapons, and although most of them had been uselessly wet, he found most of a box of 9mm rounds on a high shelf, saving them both from running out of ammunition. The other had been plain, containing only a wood table, a bench, and the massive, creeping root of the carnivorous plant that lived upstairs.
Yeah. So how do we do this?
Rebecca held up a small bottle of purplish fluid and swirled it gently, still staring at the moving tendrils.
Well, you stand back. Don't breathe too deeply. This stuff's got a couple of toxins in it that neither of us want to be ingesting, and it'll turn gaseous once it hits the infected cells.
Chris nodded.
How will we know if it's working?
Rebecca grinned.
If the vigil report is on the mark, we'll know. Watch.
She uncapped the bottle and stepped closer to the twisted root, then upended the glass vial, dousing the snaking tendrils with the watery fluid. Immediately, a billow of reddish smoke plumed up from the root as Rebecca emptied the bottle and stepped quickly away. There was a hissing, crackling sound like wet wood thrown atop a blazing fire, and within seconds, the feebly twisting fibers started to break, pieces of them snapping off and flaking away. The knotted thickness at the center started to tighten and shrink, pulling into itself. Chris watched in amazement as the giant, terrible root suddenly shriveled up into a dripping ball of mush, no bigger than a child's ball, and hung there, dead. The entire process had taken about 15 seconds. Rebecca nodded towards the door and both of them stepped out into the drying basin, Chris shaking his head.
God, what'd you put in there?
Trust me, you do not want to know. You ready to get out of here?
Chris grinned.
Let's do it.
They both jogged towards the basement doors, hurrying out into the cold corridor and back towards the ladder that led upstairs. Chris was already going over escape plans for when they left the bunkhouse. It really would depend on where the exit led. If they ended up in the woods, he was thinking that they should head towards the closest road and light a fire, then wait for help to come.
Though maybe we'll get lucky. Run across the damn parking lot for this place. We can hotwire a car and drive out. Get Irons to do something useful for him, shaped like color reinforcements.
They reached the wood corridor and headed for the plant room, both of them taking long, easy strides past the hissing green walls, finally stopping at the room that held Plant 42. Breathing deeply, Chris nodded to Rebecca. They both unholstered their weapons and Chris pushed the door open, eager to see what lay beyond the experimental plant. They stepped into a huge, open room, the smell of rotting vegetation thick in the damp air. Whatever it had looked like before, the monster that had been Plant 42 was now a massive, steaming lake of dark purple goo in the center of the room. Bloated dead vines the size of fire hoses draped limply across the floor, extending out from the livid, gelid mass. Chris scanned for the next door, saw a plain fireplace against one wall, a broken chair in a corner, and a single door that apparently led back into the bedroom he'd searched earlier. A hidden passage that he'd missed, that led to the very room in which they stood.
Must have been behind the bookcase.
There was no way out. Killing the plant had been a waste of time. It hadn't been blocking anything. Rebecca looked as disappointed as he felt, her shoulders slumped and expression grim as she studied the bare walls.
I'm sorry, Rebecca.
They both walked slowly around the room, Chris staring at the dead plant and trying to decide what to do next. Rebecca walked to the fireplace and crouched down next to it, poking at the blackened ash. He wouldn't drag her back to the mansion. Neither of them were up for it. Even with the extra ammo, there were too many snakes. They could wait in the courtyard for Brad to fly by again. Hope he got into range.
Chris, I found something!
He turned and saw her pull a couple of pieces of paper out of the ashes. The edges scorched, but both sheets otherwise intact. He walked across the room and leaned down to read over her shoulder. Felt his heart start pounding as the first words sank in. Security protocols. Basement level 1. Heliport. For executive use only. This restriction may not apply in the event of an emergency. Unauthorized persons entering the heliport will be shot on sight. Elevator. The elevator stops during emergencies. Basement level 2. Visual data room. For use by the Special Research Division only. All other access to the visual data room must be cleared with Keith Arving, room manager. Basement level 3. Prison. Sanitation Division controls the use of the prison. At least one consultant researcher, E. Smith, S. Ross, A. Wesker, must be present if viral use is authorized. Power room. Access limited to headquarters supervisors. This restriction may not apply to consultant researchers with special authorization. Basement level 4. Regarding the progress of Tyrant after use of T-Virus. The rest of the paper was burned, the words lost. A. Wesker. Captain Albert Goddamn Wesker. Barry had said that Wesker disappeared right after the Alphas had made it to the house.
And it was Wesker who led us here in the first place when the dogs attacked. Cool, competent, unreadable Wesker, working for Umbrella.
Rebecca flipped to the second page, and Chris leaned in, studying the neatly typed labels beneath the drawn boxes and lines. Mansion, courtyard, guardhouse, underground, laboratories. There was even a compass drawn next to the sketch of the mansion to show them what they'd missed. A secret entrance to the underground hidden behind the waterfall. Rebecca stood up, eyes wide and uncertain.
Captain Wesker is involved in all this?
Chris nodded slowly.
And if he's still here, he's down in those labs, maybe with the rest of the team. If Umbrella sent him here, God only knows what he's up to.
They had to find him, had to warn whoever was left of the stars that Wesker had betrayed them all. Everything was done. Wesker stepped into the elevator that led back to level 3, running through his checklist as he lowered the outer gate and slid the inner one closed.
Shackles collected, discs erased, power reconnected, Tyrant support off.
It really was too bad about the Tyrant. Ugly as it was, the thing was a marvel of surgical, chemical, and genetic engineering, and he'd stood in front of its glass chamber for a long time, studying it in silent awe before reluctantly shutting down its life support. As its stasis fluids had drained, he'd found himself imagining what it would have been like to see it in action once the researchers had completed their work. It would have been the ultimate soldier, a thing of beauty in the battlefield. And now it had to be destroyed, all because some idiot tech had hit the wrong button. A mistake that had cost Umbrella millions of dollars and killed the researchers who had created it. He hit the switch and the elevator thrummed to life, carrying him back up for his final task, activating the triggering system at the back of the power room. He'd given himself 15 minutes to make sure he was clear of the blast radius, climbed down the heliport ladder, hit the back road towards town, and boom, no more hidden Umbrella facility. At least, not in Raccoon Forest. Once he got back into the city, he'd pack a bag and head for Umbrella's private airstrip. He could make the necessary calls from there, let his contacts in the White Office know what had happened. They'd have a cleanup team standing by to comb through the forest and take out the surviving specimens, and they'd be most eager to get their hands on the tissue samples he'd taken, 2 of everything except for the Tyrant. The Tyrant scientists all dead, Umbrella had decided to shelve the project indefinitely. Wesker thought it was a mistake, but then he wasn't getting paid to think. As the elevator slid to a stop, Wesker opened the gates and stepped out, setting down the sample case. He unholstered his Beretta, going over the twisting layout of the power room in his mind. He had to make another run through the MA2s to get to the activation system. He'd already managed it once to hook up the elevator circuit, but they had been more active than he'd expected. Instead of weakening them, their hunger had driven them to new heights of viciousness. He'd been lucky to make it through unscathed. At a hydraulic hum from down the hall, Wesker froze. Footsteps clattered against the cement floor, hesitated, and then started for the power room at the opposite end of the corridor. Wesker eased up to the corner and looked down the hall just in time to see Jill Valentine disappear through the metal doors. A burst of hissing mechanical noise echoing through the corridor before they closed.
How did she make it through the hunters? Jesus.
Apparently he'd underestimated her. And she'd been alone, too. If she was that good, the MA2s might not kill her, and she had effectively just blocked him from the triggering system. He wouldn't be able to deal with the creatures that roamed the maze-like walkways and put a stop to her prying. Frustrated, Wesker scooped up the sample case and walked quickly down the hall, back towards the hydraulic doors that led to the main corridor of Level 3. If she made it back out, he'd just have to shoot her. It would only delay his escape by a few minutes. Still, it was an unexpected curve, and as far as he was concerned, it was too late in the game for surprises. Surprises pissed him off. They made him feel like he wasn't in control.
I am in control. Nothing is happening here that I can't handle. This is my game, my rules, and I will accomplish my mission without any interference from that little thief bitch.
Wesker stalked out into the main corridor, saw that Jill had managed to take out a few more of the wizened, withered scientists and technicians that wandered the basement labs. 2 of them lay just outside the door, their skulls blown into arid powder by what looked like shotgun blasts. He kicked one of them angrily, boot crunching into the corpse's brittle ribs, the dry snap of bone loud in the silence. Except that suddenly, he heard heavy boots coming down the metal stairs from B2, the hollow clump echoing through the hall. And then a rough, hesitant voice calling out, "Jill?"
Barry Burton. As I live and breathe.
Wesker raised his weapon coolly, ready to fire when Barry stepped into view, and then lowered it thoughtfully. After a moment, a slow grin spread across his face. Chapter 18. Jill eased into the steaming, hissing room, a thick smell of grease in the heated air. It was some kind of a boiler room, and a big one. Heavy, thrumming machinery filled the large chamber, surrounded by winding catwalks. Massive turbines spun and pounded, generating power in a steady whine as hidden ducts spat out steam at short intervals. She moved slowly into the poorly lit chamber, peering down one of the railed walkways to the fluctuating shadows cast by the towering generators. From where she was, she could see that the place was a labyrinth of paths, twining around the giant blocks of noisy machinery.
The source of the estate's power. That explains how they managed to keep it a secret for so long. They had their own little city out here, totally autonomous. Probably had their food shipped in too.
She turned down the narrow walk to her right, watching uneasily for any more of the strange, pale zombies that she'd seen in the corridors of B3. The path seemed clear, but with the movement and noise created by the turbines, something ripped at her left shoulder, a sudden violent slash that tore open her vest and scraped the skin beneath. Jill spun and fired, the roar of the shotgun drowning out the hissing machines. The blast hit metal, pellets ricocheting into the empty walk. There was nothing behind her.
Where?
A lunging, blade-like claw sliced in the air in front of her face, swooping down from above. She stumbled back, staring up at the steel mesh of the ceiling, and saw a dark shape skitter out of the shadows, hooking its way across the grate incredibly fast, curving claws at its hands and feet. She caught a glimpse of thick spines around its mutant, flattened face, then it turned and ran into the thrumming shadows of the power room. There was a door at the end of the walk, and Jill sprinted towards it, heart racing, the pounding whine of the generators thundering in her ears. She was 5 feet from the door when she saw the moving shadow position itself in front of her. She raised the shotgun and leaned back. More of them. There were 2 of the vicious creatures overhead, squat, terrible things with vicious, curving hooks instead of hands. One of them dropped down suddenly, hanging by clawed feet to swipe at her with its bladed arm. Jill fired and the creature screeched, the blast hitting it in the chest. It fell from the ceiling with a clatter, thick blood oozing out of the ragged wound. She turned back towards the entrance and ran, hearing the patter of claws against the mesh overhead. Another of the aberrant monkey-like things swung down in front of her. Jill ducked, afraid to stop running. The thing's strange arm whistled past her ear, missing her head by less than an inch. The metal doors were in front of her. Jill crashed into them, slapping one handle down and stumbling back into the cold stillness of the corridor. The door closed on the furious, shrill cry of one of the monsters, rising high over the sounds of the working machines. She sagged against the door, gasping, and saw Barry Burton standing midway down the chilled, silent hall. He hurried towards her, an expression of deep worry on his rugged, bearded face. "Jill! Are you alright?" She pushed away from the door, surprised.
God, Barry, where have you been? I thought you'd gotten lost in the tunnels.
Barry nodded grimly. "I did, and I ran into some trouble trying to get out." She saw the splatters of blood on his clothing, the rips and tears in his shirt, and realized that he must have come across more of those walking green nightmares. He looked like he'd been through a war.
Speaking of...
Jill touched her shoulder, her fingers coming away bloody. It was painful but shallow. She'd survive.
Barry, we've got to get out of here. I found some papers upstairs, proof of what's been going on. Enrico was right. Umbrella's behind all of this, and one of the stars knew about it. It's too dangerous to keep looking around. We should get those files and head back to the mansion, wait for the RPD.
But I think I found the main lab. Downstairs, there's an elevator at the end of the hall. There are computers and stuff. We can get into their files. Really nail them. He didn't seem excited by the find. Jill barely noticed. With the information they could get from Umbrella's database, names, dates, research material,
we can find out everything. Present the investigators with the whole messy package.
Jill nodded, grinning.
Lead the way.
The tunnels had been a cold, miserable maze, but the map had led them through quickly. Rebecca and Chris had reached the first basement level, both of them shivering and wet, and not a little freaked out by the dead creatures they'd passed along the way. The Umbrella scientists had been disgustingly creative in their approach to making monsters. Chris rattled the door that supposedly led to the heliport, but it was solidly locked, an emergency sign next to it implying that it could only be opened by an alarm system. He'd hoped to send Rebecca out with the radio while he searched for the others. He looked down the narrow stairwell and sighed, turning to her. "I want you to stay here. If you stand by the elevator, you should be able to pick up Brad's signal from outside. Tell him where we are and what happened. And if I'm not back in 20 minutes, go back to the courtyard and wait there until help comes." Flustered, Rebecca shook her head.
But I want to go with you. I can take care of myself. And if you find the lab, you won't need me to tell you what you're looking at.
No. For all we know, Wesker already killed the other stars and is looking to finish the job. If we're the last ones, we can't risk both of us getting ambushed. Somebody has to survive and tell people about Umbrella. I'm sorry, but it's the only way. He smiled at her, putting a hand on her shoulder. And I know you can take care of yourself.
This isn't a question about your competence, okay? 20 minutes. I just have to see if anyone else made it.
Rebecca opened her mouth as if to protest further, and then closed it, nodding slowly.
Okay. I'll stay. 20 minutes.
Chris turned and started down the ladder, hoping he could keep his promise to come back. The captain had successfully deceived them all, acting the part of concerned leader for weeks while the people in Raccoon City had died. And all along, he'd known why. The man was a sociopath. It seemed that Umbrella had created more than one kind of monster, and it was time to find out how much damage he'd done. Barry couldn't bring himself to look at Jill as they took the elevator down to B4. Wesker would be waiting for them at the bottom, and Jill would find out that he'd been helping the captain all along. He'd killed 3 more of the violent, springing creatures down in the tunnels before making it to the lab, only to run into Wesker, who had insisted that he lure Jill down to B4 and assist him in locking her up. The smiling bastard had reminded Barry of his family's situation, and promised again that it was the last thing he'd have to do, that after Jill was safely locked away, he'd call off his people.
Except he said that every time. Find the crests and you're free. Help me in the tunnels, you're free. Betray your friend.
Barry, are you okay?
He turned to her as the elevator stopped, looking miserably into her concerned, thoughtful eyes.
I've been worried about you ever since we got to the mansion. I even thought... Well, never mind what I thought. Is something wrong?
He pulled the gate open and raised the mesh outer door, an excuse to look away.
Yeah, something's wrong. But now's not the time. Let's just get this over with.
Jill frowned but nodded, still looking concerned.
Okay. When this is over, we can talk.
You won't want to talk to me when this is over.
Barry stepped out into the short hallway and Jill followed, their boots clanking across the steel grate. The hall turned to the left just ahead, and Barry slowed down on the pretense of checking his weapon, letting Jill get in front of him. They turned the corner and Jill froze, staring into the muzzle of Wesker's raised Beretta. He grinned at them, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, his smile smug and leering.
Hello, Jill. Nice of you to drop by. Nice work, Barry. Take her weapons.
She turned her startled gaze to him as he quickly plucked the shotgun from her hands, then reached around to unholster her Beretta, his face burning.
Now, get back up to B1 and wait for me by the exit. I'll be up in a few minutes.
Barry stared at him. But you say you just wanted to lock her up. Wesker shook his head.
Oh, don't worry. I'm not going to hurt her. I promise. Now get going.
Jill looked at him, confusion and fear and anger playing across her face.
Barry?
I'm sorry, Jill.
He turned and walked around the corner, feeling defeated and ashamed, not to mention terrified for Jill. Wesker had promised, but Wesker's word meant nothing. He was probably going to kill her as soon as he heard the elevator doors closed.
But what if I'm not in the elevator? Maybe I can still do something to keep her alive.
Barry hurried to the lift and opened the gates. He slammed them closed and pushed the operation switch, sending it back to B3 without a passenger. Moving silently, he edged back towards the corner, listening.
Can't say I'm all that surprised. But how did you get Barry to help you?
Old Barry's got some trouble at home. I told him that Umbrella has a team watching his house, waiting to kill his precious family. He was only too happy to help.
Barry clenched his fists, his jaw tight.
You're a bastard, you know that?
Maybe. But I'm going to be a rich bastard when all this is over. Umbrella is paying me a lot of money to clean up their little problem, and to get rid of a few of you goddamn snooping stars in the process.
Why would Umbrella want to destroy the stars?
Oh, not all of them. They've got big plans for some of us. At least those of us that want to make a profit. It's you sniveling do-gooders that they don't want. The red, white, and blue, apple pie, all that happy bullshit. The way Redfield's been running around mouthing off about conspiracies, you think Umbrella didn't notice? It has to stop here.
This whole place was ready to blow up, just in case of an accident and the tyrant virus escaping qualifies. Once you're all dead and the facility's destroyed, no one will be able to get to the truth. Son of a bitch was going to kill all of us. But enough about Umbrella. I had you brought down here for a little experiment of my own. I want to see how our most agile team member stands up against the miracle of modern science. If you'll just step through that door.
Barry flattened himself against the wall as Wesker stepped back, part of his shoulder coming into view. He put his hand on his coat and drew it out slowly.
I can't believe you're doing this. Selling out to protect a bunch of unethical corporate blackmailers.
Blackmailers? Oh, you mean Barry? Umbrella wouldn't bother with blackmail. They can afford to buy people just as easily. I made all that up to get him on board.
Barry slammed the butt of his Colt into Wesker's skull as hard as he could, dropping him like a ton of bricks. Chapter 19. Jill stared in astonishment as Wesker suddenly stopped talking and crumpled to the floor, and Barry stepped into view, staring down at Wesker's body with a look of intense hatred, cold in hand. She crouched down next to Wesker and pried the Beretta from his fingers, tucking it into her waistband. Barry turned to look at her, his eyes swimming with apology.
Jill, I'm so sorry. I never should have believed him.
Jill stared at him for a moment, thinking about his daughters. Moira was Becky McGee's age.
It's okay. You came back. That's what matters.
Barry handed her back her weapons, and they both gazed down at Wesker's sprawled form, still breathing but unconscious. He was out cold.
I don't suppose you have any handcuffs on you?
Jill shook her head.
Maybe we should check out the lab. There's bound to be some cable or cord we can use. Besides, I'm kind of curious about this miracle of modern science he was talking about.
She turned and found the switch that operated the hydraulic door, noting the biohazard symbol painted across the front. The door slid open and the two of them stepped inside.
Wow.
It was a huge, high-ceiling chamber, lined with monitoring consoles, cables snaking across the floor and connecting to a whole series of standing glass tubes. There were 8 of the tubes lined up in the center of the room, each of them big enough to hold a grown man. They were all empty. Barry reached down and scooped up a handful of cable, digging into his pocket for a knife while Jill walked towards the back, gazing at the technical and medical equipment, and stopped, staring, feeling her jaw drop. Against the back wall was a much larger tube, at least 8 or 9 feet tall, hooked up to its own computer console. And the thing inside filled it top to bottom. It was monstrous. Jill, I got the cable. Barry stopped next to her, his words faltering as he saw the abomination. Silently, they both walked towards it, unable to resist a closer look. It was tall, but proportionally correct, at least through the broad muscular torso and long legs. Those parts appeared human. One of its arms had been altered into a cluster of massive, dragging claws hanging past its knees, while the other one seemed ordinary, if overly large. There was a thick, bloody tumor protruding from where its heart would be. Joe realized, staring at the bulbous mass, that it was the thing's heart. It was pulsing slowly, expanding and contracting in slow, rhythmic beats. She stopped in front of the tube, awed by the abomination. She could see lines of scar tissue snaking across its limbs, surgical scars. It had no sexual organs, they'd been cut away. She looked up at its face and saw that parts of the flesh there had also been removed. The lips were gone, and it seemed to grin broadly at her through the sliced red tissue of its face, all of its teeth exposed.
Tyrant.
Jill glanced over at him, saw him frowning down at the computer that was hooked up to the tube by multiple cables. She looked back at the tyrant, feeling nearly overwhelmed by pity and disgust. Whatever it was now, it had once been a man. Umbrella had turned him into a freakish horror.
We can't leave it like this.
Barry nodded. She joined him at the console, looking down at the myriad switches and buttons. There had to be a switch that would put an end to its life. It deserved that much. There was a set of 6 red switches in a row along the bottom, and Barry flipped one of them down. Nothing seemed to happen. He glanced at her, She nodded for him to continue. He used the side of his hand to flip all of them. There was a sudden, dull thump. They both whirled around, saw the timer pull back its human hand and hit the glass again. Cracks webbed out from the impact, though the glass had to be several inches thick. Oh, shit! Barry grabbed her arm as the creature drew its bleeding knuckles back for another blow. Run! They ran. Jill wished to God they'd left it alone, panic welling up from deep inside of her. Barry slammed his hand down on the door control, and it slid open as behind them, glass shattered. They stumbled through the door, terrified, Barry hitting the lock, and saw that Wesker was gone. Wesker stumbled towards the power room, his head pounding, his limbs feeling strangely distant and weak. He felt like he was going to throw up.
God damn, Barry.
They'd taken his gun. He'd come to as they'd walked into the lab and reeled towards the elevator, cursing them both. Cursing Umbrella for creating such a screwed up mess. Cursing himself for not simply killing the stars when he could have.
It's not over. I'm still in control. This is my game.
The sample case was down in the lab, probably being destroyed right now by one of those idiots. Tyrant, too. That magnificent creature, powerless without the adrenaline injections. Dead. They'd shoot him in his sleeping heart. He'd die without ever tasting battle. Wesker reached the door to the room and leaned against it, struggling to catch his breath. Blood dribbled out of his ears and he shook his head, trying to clear it of the strange fog that had settled into his brain. He didn't have the tissue samples, but he could still complete his mission. It was important, very important, that he complete his mission. It was about control, and control was his game.
Triggering system. Watch out for the monkeys.
The MA2s, he had to be careful. Wesker opened the door and pitched forward, the ground seeming too far away and then too close. The machines were hissing at him, whining and hissing in the hot, oily air. His hand found the railing and he pulled himself towards the back of the room, trying to hurry but finding that his legs weren't interested. A claw shot down from above and tore into his scalp, yanking away a clump of hair. He felt warm liquid trickle down the back of his neck, stumbled on, the pain in his head sharper now.
Took my gun, stupid assholes took my gun.
He reached the door and had just managed to get it open when something heavy landed on his back, knocking him into the next room. He fell on the cold metal floor and a terrible shriek sounded in his ear. Thick talons punctured the skin on his back, and Wesker slapped at it. At the grinning, screaming thing that was trying to kill him. He hit the creature as hard as he could, shoving the heel of his hand into its throat. It leaped away, landing on the mesh wall and clambering back up to the ceiling. Wesker pulled himself up and stumbled on, fresh waves of pain and nausea washing over him. The air was too hot, the turbines loud and relentless in their spinning, throbbing frenzy. But he could see the door to the back now, the door that led to the completion of his mission.
All the stars, dead, blown into orbit while I escape, flying away a rich man.
He flung the door open and made his way towards the small glowing screen in the back corner. It was quieter here, cooler. The massive machines that filled the chamber hummed softly at him, their purpose quite different than the ones outside. These were the machines that wanted to help him regain his control. The noise from the open door behind him seemed far away as he reached the glowing screen, his fingers numb as they touched the keyboard beneath. He found the keys he needed, the code spilling out across the monitor in soft green after only a few mistakes. A sexy, quiet voice informed him that the countdown would begin in 30 seconds. Dizzy, he tried to remember the setting for the timer. The system would trigger automatically in 5 minutes, but he had to reset it, give himself time to get reoriented and make his way outside. Behind him, something screamed. Wesker whirled around, confused. He saw 4 of the mesh monkeys running at him, lashing out with long, curved hands as they reached him. Terrible pain shot up through his legs and he fell, crashing to the hard steel floor.
This can't happen.
One of the creatures jumped onto his chest and suddenly Wesker couldn't breathe, couldn't even raise his weak arms to push it away. Another tore into his leg, ripping away a thick chunk of flesh with its hooked claw. The third and fourth screamed in savage glee, dancing around him like dark, vicious children, lifting their claws as they pranced on squat legs. Somehow, there was blood in his eyes, and the world was spinning away, screams and hisses and incredible searing heat blurring his vision, his mind.
Tyrant has come.
Wesker could feel it. Feel the presence of something vast and powerful touching him. Grinning through the pain, he searched for it through the red haze of his failing vision, wanting more than anything to see it slaughter his attackers in a glory of perfect motion. But he could only make out the immense shadow that seemed to flood over him, through him. Could only imagine that the powerful, magnificent warrior was reaching down to lift him from his torment.
I control. Let me see.
Darkness stole his hopes away, and Wesker thought no more.
Stars Alpha Team! Bravo! Anybody! If you can't answer, try to signal! I'm running out of fuel! Do you read? This is Brad! Repeat! Stars Alpha Team!
Rebecca hit the button, talking fast. Brad! There's a heliport at the Spencer Estate! You have to get to the heliport! Brad! Come in! There was a high, whining squeal, and Rebecca heard what must have been the word copy, but the rest was lost.
I copy? Or do you copy?
There was no way to know. Frustrated and worried, Rebecca held onto the radio tightly, hoping that he'd heard her. Suddenly, a shrill alarm blared into the silent room through some hidden speaker in the ceiling. Rebecca jumped, staring around the cold chamber helplessly. There was a buzzing click from inside the door that led to the heliport, and she hurried over, grabbing the handle and pulling it open. It had unlocked. A cool, female voice began to speak, slowly and clearly over the jangling alarm. The triggering system has now been activated. All personnel must evacuate immediately or process the activation. You have 5 minutes. The triggering system has now been activated. As the recorded message repeated, Rebecca stood in the open doorway and watched the open ladder shaft, her blood racing, wanting to see Chris emerge from the levels below. He'd only been gone for a few minutes, but their time had just run out. Chapter 20. Jill and Barry ran from the elevator back towards the main hall for B3, cool voice informing them that they had 4.5 minutes. They hit the open corridor at a dead run, sprinting around the corner, and saw Chris Redfield halfway up the metal stairs. Chris! He spun around, his face lighting up as he saw them dashing towards him. Hurry! There's a heliport on B1.
Thank God.
Chris waited until they reached the base of the stairs and then ran ahead, rushing around the walkway and holding open the door that led to the ladder. Jill and Barry made it to the top and sped through, the computer telling them that they had 4 minutes, 15 seconds to get away. Barry went up the ladder first, and Jill followed, Chris right behind. They piled out into B1. Jill saw that Rebecca Chambers was standing at the emergency exit, her youthful face tight with anxiety. Chris hustled her through the door, and the four of them ran through a winding concrete hall, Jill praying silently that they'd have time to clear the estate.
I hope you burn here, Wesker.
There was a large elevator at the end of the corridor. Barry slammed the gate open, holding it as they rushed inside. He jumped in after them. They had 4 minutes even. The elevator seemed to crawl upwards, and Jill looked at her watch, heart pounding as the seconds ticked past.
Not gonna make it. We'll never make it.
The lift hummed to a stop, and Chris yanked the gate open, the cool air of early morning sweeping over them, and the sweet, wondrous sound of a helicopter overhead, circling. He heard me! Jill grinned, feeling a sudden wave of affection for the rookie. The heliport was huge, the wide, flat space surrounded by high walls, a circle of yellow paint on the asphalt showing Brad where to set down. Barry and Chris both waved their arms frantically, signaling the pilot to hurry as Jill looked at her watch again. A little over 3.5 minutes remained. More than enough time. Jill whirled around, saw chunks of concrete and tar fly into the air and rain down over the northwest corner of the landing pad. The giant claw stretched up from the hole, fell across the jagged lip, and the pale, hulking tyrant leaped out onto the heliport, rose smoothly from its agile crouch, and started towards them.
What the hell is that?
It had to be 8 feet tall, parts of its giant body mutilated and deformed, its grinning face focusing on them even as it stood up. It moved towards them at a slow walk, a massive claw of its left arm flexing.
No time. Brad can't land.
Chris targeted the dark, tumorous thing on his chest and fired, pulling the trigger 5 times in rapid succession, 3 of the rounds finding their mark. The other 2 were within an inch of the pulsing redness, and the creature didn't even slow down.
Scatter!
The stars split, Jill pulling Rebecca to the farthest corner from the towering monster, Chris sprinting towards the southern wall. Barry stood his ground, pointing his Colt at the approaching beast. 3 .357 rounds slammed into its belly, the thundering shots echoing against the high concrete walls. The creature suddenly sped up, running towards Barry, drawing its giant claw back, and as Barry dove out of the way, the thing swept past him in a running crouch, bringing its claw up as if throwing a ball underhand. Its talons gouged at the asphalt, ripping through it as though it were no more than solid water. As soon as the monster was past, it stopped running, turning almost casually back to watch Barry scramble to his feet and fire again. The bullet took out a fleshy chunk of its right shoulder. Thick blood coursed down its wide chest and joined the dripping, open mass of its stomach. Overhead, the Alpha Copter still circled, unable to land, and there was still no sign that the immense creature felt the injuries. It started its run again, dropping its terrible, inhuman hand down as it went for Barry, just as the revolver clicked on empty. Barry sprinted away, but the charging monster veered with him, and its sweeping claw glanced against his side, tumbling him to the ground.
Barry!
Chris raced towards the creature, firing into its back as it bent down over the fallen Alpha. Barry was scrambling backwards, his vest shredded, his eyes wide with terror, and it must have felt the sting of the bullets because it turned, fixing its emotionless stare on Chris. Barry staggered to his feet and limped quickly away.
We don't have any time.
Chris emptied the clip, the last several rounds hitting it in the face. Pieces of tooth flew from the creature's lipless mouth, splattering to the asphalt in a rain of white and red. The creature didn't seem to notice as it started to run towards him at incredible speed. Jill and Rebecca were both firing, shouting, trying to turn its attention away from Chris, but it was already fixated, pounding towards him and drawing its claw back.
Wait for it.
He dove to the side at the last possible second, and the monster went flying past, his claw mulching the asphalt where he'd just been standing. Chris ran, the horrible awareness dawning on him that the seconds were slipping past and that they couldn't kill it in time. Barry felt blood seeping from his thigh, topped several layers of his skin sliced neatly away by the tyrant's brutal swipe. The pain was bearable. The knowledge that they were going to die wasn't.
We'll blow up if we don't get chopped to pieces first.
Tyrant turned its attention to Jill and Rebecca, both of them firing again at the seemingly invulnerable monster. It started its smooth, easy walk towards them, still indifferent to the bloody holes in its body. Shotgun blasts hit it in the leg and chest. 9mm bullets speckled the pasty flesh, and it didn't falter, kept on walking. Wind whipped down over Barry as the roar of the helicopter's blades suddenly got louder. He heard a screaming shout coming from above. Incoming! Barry stared up at the copter, hovering only 20 feet from the ground, saw a heavy black object fly out of the open door on its side, hitting the tar with an audible thud. Chris was closest. He ran for it. The tyrant had almost reached Jill and Rebecca. 2 of them split, each headed in a different direction, and the creature turned towards Jill without hesitating, tracking her with its strange, fixed gaze.
Jill! This way!
Barry spun, saw that Chris had the bulky rocket launcher propped on his shoulder.
Yes!
Jill veered towards Chris, the tyrant close behind.
Clear!
She leaped to one side and rolled as Chris fired. The whoosh of the rocket-propelled grenade almost lost to the thundering beat of the copter's rotors. The explosion wasn't. The grenade hit the tyrant square in the chest, and in a burst of incendiary light and deafening sound, blew the monster into a million smoking pieces. Even as tattered shreds of flesh and bone hailed down over them, Brad lowered the copter back towards the ground and the 4 stars ran for it. The rails hadn't touched yet as Jill dove into the open cabin, Chris and Rebecca and Barry all throwing themselves in after her. Go, Brad! Now! The bird lifted into the air and sped away. Chapter 21. The calm, female voice fell only on inhuman ears.
You have 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. System activation now. A circuit ran the length and width of the estate connected. With an earth-shattering thunderclap of motion and sound, the Spencer estate exploded. Devices went off simultaneously in the basement of the mansion, beneath the reservoir, behind a plain, uninteresting fireplace in the guardhouse, and in the third level of the basement laboratories. Marble walls tumbled down over the disintegrating floors of the fine old mansion. Rock collapsed, and concrete blew into a fine blackened dust. Massive fireballs rose up into the early morning sky and could be seen from miles away in their brief few seconds of brilliant life. As the incredible peal of booming sound rolled across the forest and died away, the wreckage started to burn. Epilogue. The four of them were quiet as Brad piloted the copter back towards the city, and though he had a million questions, something about their silence didn't invite conversation. Chris and Joe were both staring out the hatch window at the spreading fire that had been the estate, their expressions grim. Barry was slumped against the cabin wall, looking down at his hands like he'd never seen them before. The new girl was quietly moving among them, treating their wounds without saying a word. Brad kept his mouth shut, still feeling crappy about taking off earlier. He'd been through hell since then, flying around in circles and watching the fuel gauge slowly drop. It had been a total nightmare, and he had to take a piss like nobody's business. And then that monster. He shuddered. Whatever it had been, he was glad it was dead. It had taken all of his nerve not to fly away the second he'd laid eyes on it. As far as he was concerned, he deserved a little consideration for managing to kick the launcher out the door. He glanced back at the silent foursome, wondering if he should tell them about the weird call he'd gotten over the radio. Right after the rookie had screamed something about a heliport through the static, a clear, solid signal had come in, a male voice calmly giving him the exact coordinates. The guy had been listening in, which was weird, but the fact that he knew the location well enough to give Brad directions was downright spooky. He frowned, trying to remember the mystery man's name. Thad? Terrence? Trent. That's it. He said his name was Trent. Brad decided that it would keep for another day. For now, he just wanted to go home.
Resident Evil: The Umbrella Conspiracy. Written by S.D. Perry, narrated and voice acted by Kenny Rutter. All sound effects pulled from YouTube. Featured music in order of appearance: July 24th, 1998 by GMH Sound Team from Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. Optimus by Steve Jablonsky from Transformers. Xanarkand by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy X. Unity Duty Destiny by Poker Mask from music inspired by Bionicle. Bombing Mission by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy XIII Hanging Edge by the London Philharmonic Orchestra from Greatest Video Game Music. The Man with the Machine Gun by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VIII. Danger in the Forest by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy IX. Rakshi Washed and Chilled by Nathan First from Bionicle Mask of Light. Run by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy IX. Shadows Are Everywhere by Nathan First from Bionicle Mask of Light. Anthem of the Dead by Jeff Rona from God of War 2. Trail of Blood by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Eternal Mystery by Midnight Syndicate from Dungeons & Dragons. Kagome's Theme by Kaoru Wada from Inuyasha. Shinra Inc. by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Hurry by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Escaping Dark Hunters by Nathan First from Bionicle 2 Legends of Metru Nui. The Evil Within by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy IX. Inside the Mines by Alexander Desplat from Godzilla. The Grey Hunt by Critical Role and Omar Fidel from Welcome to Tal'Dorei. Log of Lost Souls by Ron Fish from God of War 2. The Wave by Alexander Desplat from Godzilla. Infiltrating Shinra by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Mark of a Traitor by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Birth of a God by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. Last Shot by Alexander Desplat from Godzilla. Genova by Nobuo Uematsu from Final Fantasy VII. And The Champion's Goodbye by Critical Role and Matthew Carl Earl from Welcome to Tal'Dorei. All sounds and property of their respective owners. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Conspiracy was published in 1998 by Pocket Books, a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. Coming soon, Resident Evil Book 2, Caliban Cove.